Oh, come on, what an honor it is to be with you. And, I don't really know how to follow that video, and Chris is in just honor. I do know that the reason he says that is because he knew what I was like. Chris and I got some stories from back in the day. But such an honor it is to be here, to be with you, being here as family. And I just honor you and love you. And today I really do want to come and share something that has just been in my heart for a while. It's actually something that for me personally has been a significant invitation of the last year of my life from Jesus. And as I thought through and considered what I felt and wanted to share with you this morning and talked with Chris through it, I want to take some time this morning with you and talk about faith. And in many ways share with you a crash course bit of a journey that I myself have been on of a reclaiming in this season of the substance of faith. And what I can tell you in my own life is I feel from the Spirit of God an urgency to walk in a capacity of faith. I feel in my own life an invitation to break off false ideas, to no longer allow or linger in false patterns of how easy it is to let caricatures of faith come into my life. And in many ways, what it has done over the last year, I have studied centrally around this invitation like never before. And there is a clarifying that has happened in my own life. And in that clarifying, there are some invitations that I have for you. In many ways, I have one invitation for you, but I want to walk through a greater picture and understanding to get there. If I was a master teacher, I would be able to communicate this to you far simpler. But as I am what I am, I'm just going to throw a bunch of information at you, and hopefully it kind of some of it sticks to the wall. And at the end, it'll help us discern an invitation that I believe matters for us. Jesus is inviting us into faith. I want to tell you that what is in your life, I don't need to know you. I don't need to know your story to know that in front of your life are complications that require faith. But I can say this with confidence, that the season that is ahead of us as a church and the season that is ahead of you distinctly as a local church, Mill Creek Foursquare, is a season that is going to require faith. And I believe that God wants to strengthen and bring that faith alive. But if we begin to unpack faith, what we find is that we have some struggles along the way. There's this moment in Mark chapter 9. It's a very famous passage. I think it kind of captures something. Here's Jesus is speaking, and it says this in Mark chapter 9, verse 21. He says, "So he asked his father, 'How long has this been happening to him?' And he said, 'From childhood. And often he has thrown himself both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us.' Jesus said to him, 'If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes.' Immediately, the father of the child cried out and said with tears, 'Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.'" And this passage has lots of implications and lots of specific details that are not the point of my teaching this morning, but I want to present this picture because within the story is not only these really central truths for what was happening between Jesus and this father, but there's a human story. This father comes to Jesus out of desperation. His child has been experiencing a level of suffering that we see just as of terror and torment. And he comes to Jesus in a place of desperation, crying out for Jesus to help. And isn't it interesting that as he cries out for Jesus to help, he says, "If you can." I wonder how many times you and I, we come to Jesus and the loudest voice in our longing is, "If you can, will you, could you, do you see me?" Man, how loud the "if" is in us. And for lots of reasons. Sometimes our if is quite uncertain whether he's even real. Sometimes our if is if he's able. But most of our time, our if is if he will, if he cares, and if he loves us. And Jesus, you see it, he centers back on that statement. Oh, if I can. If I can. Well, I can, in the subtext of the passage. He goes, how about this? If you believe, all things become possible. And this is a challenge for us. Because Jesus isn't lying. But then we suddenly, in Jesus' response back, get confronted with all of our uncertainties. But we have to let the picture stay simple for a moment. Jesus says, in your if, I'm inviting you back with another one. If you can walk in faith, things that are currently impossible suddenly become possible. That's what Jesus is saying. I'll meet your if with another if, and I'm telling you, where you can find your way through that if into this if, suddenly you enter a place called faith. And faith is the place where impossible things find their possibilities. And this is the man's response. He calls back to Jesus, Jesus, I believe you, and I don't believe you. Help me. You ever felt that? Jesus, I believe you. I really believe you, and I really don't believe you, and I need your help. I believe. Would you help my unbelief? Or in another way, I have faith. Same word. Trust, faith, belief. All get translated. Same core Greek word. I have faith, and I don't have faith. What do I do? Isn't it amazing? In essence, right, those two ideas should not be compatible. You shouldn't be able to go, I believe you, I don't believe you, and all of us are like, yep, I know exactly what that's like. Because behind this story, it's our story. What's in the heart of the Father is what is in our hearts. It's a tension of belief and unbelief, a tension of faith and lack of faith, a tension of a life filled with all of the ifs. And I want to tell you that Jesus wants to invite you into a life of faith, because it's actually the ifs that he wants to rescue you from. The revelation of what God's trying to do in your life through faith is not about handing you a cheap promise like a genie trick, where somehow if you can just feel something enough, suddenly you have the capability of all of your dreams coming true, which is part of the peddling of faith that you and I don't know what to do with, so we pull back from it. But what Jesus is actually trying to say is there is this place in faith where there is a knowing of God that actually moves you out of the places you fear into the fullness of the life that God has longed for you to have. And the journey of faith, the invitation of faith, is about a transformation of your life that requires you starting where this man starts, with all of your ifs and all of your beliefs and all of your half-beliefs and all of your unbeliefs. Can I tell you the greatest thing that is robbing our generation from faith is that we don't have the courage to start where the Father starts. Can I just invite you, the first step of faith would be telling Jesus all the places you don't believe him. Because the reality is that God cares far more about your sincerity than he does about your performance. And often the breakthrough of faith starts in the sincerity of where you lack it. And what you're actually admitting in the place of lack of faith is a lack of certainty about the character of God, the character of your own life, and what it really means to stand in the presence of Jesus. And I just want to tell you, the movement of faith that Jesus wants to do in us and in Mill Creek Foursquare is going to require a group of people who have the courage to go, I believe you, Jesus, and I don't believe you, Jesus, and I don't know how to sort through that mess. Every Sunday we come with some measure of performance. Could I maybe just invite you that revival and transformation in your future might just start with taking the mask off and worshiping Jesus in all of the places you don't believe him. Because sincerity is what draws God's heart. And sincerity is what creates the honesty for God to move in our lives. Now, one quick word on sincerity, because one thing I know is that Mill Creek Foursquare is a church of sincerity. It's the mark of Chris and Jen's life, undeniably. And it's the mark of this house. We are a church, you are a church that values sincerity. But what I also find is that when people value sincerity, they can often allow false ideas to inform it. Let me tell you what sincerity isn't. Sincerity isn't you being honest with your current state of emotion. That's actually secular sincerity, and the idea that sincerity is like, well, this is how I feel right now, so this is my sincere position. Let me explain this to you so I think you'll understand it. I am in love with my wife. We've been married 20 years, and can I just tell you, when I met my wife at 19, I was, anybody remember Bambi? I was Twitter-pated, right? I was gone. The Phil Manginelli that existed before that moment ceased to exist. In that moment, I had emotions and love and desire like I have never known before in my life, and it lasted quite a while. It was the single greatest experience of emotional love of my life. Now, 22-ish years later, married 20 years later, I don't always feel that. You know, there are times 20 years in, I have high highs. I look at my wife and she's just incredible and godly and beautiful. And I love her. I have emotional love deeply for my wife. And there are times where I'm like, you are stubborn and wrong and rude and you are unwilling to admit, I have 20 years of marriage. And guess what? Even in my highest highs, I've never felt what I felt at 19. Statistically, the initial moments of love are an experience that are wild. But can I tell you, my love for my wife now is so much more beyond an emotional experience. I wouldn't go back to 19 for a minute. I wouldn't trade what I have with Emily right now for anything. The love I have with my wife right now is the greatest love I've ever known. It's the deepest love I've ever known. It's the most secure love I've ever known. That was high emotion, cheap and flimsy and selfish. I was overwhelmed by so many parts of her, but I wasn't thinking about, wow, to lay down my life for her. See, you and I have this idea that sincerity is the height of your emotions. No, it is not. You wanna know what sincere love is? Sincere love is staying faithful to your covenant to somebody on the days you feel it the least. You wanna know how I express my sincerity to my wife? It's that I love her the same on the worst days as I would love her on the best days. Sincerity and faithfulness to Jesus isn't that you feel it all the time. Do you remember what it was like when he rescued you? Do you remember those first moments when Jesus rescued your life? I do. Same time period as falling in love with Emily. These things happen in my life. But I can tell you, I have never experienced emotional highs with Jesus like when he rescued me from death itself. Oh my gosh, I was an insane man. All I wanted to do was give my life on the mission field for him forever. I was gone in love with Jesus, an emotional experience of saving like never before. 20 years later, 22, 23 years later, I've had some silent night seasons. I've had some deep wrestlings of my faith. I've had people pass away and perform funerals I've never wanted to be a part of. I've had questions feel like they go unanswered. I've had my own selfishness and sin exposed in front of me. I've had the worst of other people affect my life. It gets hard. And sometimes I don't feel everything I once felt. I have a very real love for Jesus, and it is often an emotional love inside of me, but my sincerity is not what I offer Jesus when it's easy. It is what I offer Jesus when it is hard. Because the sincerity of my life is when I hold on to faith in the midst of the realities of the highest highs and the lowest lows. And see, for us, we have bought into the secular myths of emotions and experiences, the great truth tellers of our lives. And then we turn faith into an emotion and an experience, which is not actually what it is. And when you begin to learn what the substance of faith is, it can often conjure great emotion. It certainly is going to be connected to experience, but it is a substance that goes so far beyond them. And when we learn to walk in faith, true faith, you begin to find how it's meant to navigate the stories of our lives. Your life was made to find faith. And your future walks through the doorways of faith. And we have to be a people who reclaim it. But we have to recognize there are some distortions that lead us to our misunderstandings. First, the truth is, we have just become a people who have really lost the value system of trust itself. Our culture lives in a crash of trust that has really never kind of existed statistically in the world before. Let me give you some statistics in the midst of this. In 1964, 77% of Americans trusted the government to do what was right, down to 16% in 2023. 50 or so years, 77% down to 16%. That's a pretty big loss. Can I tell you though, when I look at the statistic, who are those 16%, right? I look at it, and on one hand, I'm like, that's crazy. That's a crazy descent of lack of trust. But find me those 16% that can look me in the eyes and go, yeah, the government's gonna do the right thing. Like, who are you? Who believes that? Right, 1976, 72% of Americans, again, this is a Gallup poll, 72% of Americans trusted mass media to report the news had to be fully, accurately, and fairly. So at one point, 72% of Americans in 76, down to 34% in 2022. Again, I'm like, who are those 34%? To hit all of those paradigms, right? 1985, 67% of Americans trusted pastors to be honest and ethical, down to 34% in 2022. I could give you more and more statistics, but you look at our society in the last 50, 60, 70 years to today, every single portion of society has a collapse of trust. A part of that is as technology rises, the world becomes smaller. You and I become far more aware of things that are happening. And as we become more aware of things that are happening, we realize things we placed our trust in aren't quite as trustworthy as they used to be. But it's not just simply a greater revelation. Our culture is built on a foundation of mistrust. And we have to understand that you and I bring mistrust to the table in everything that we do, and we also bring mistrust to the table in our relationship with God. And in that mistrust, what often happens is an issue like faith. Isn't it interesting? Faith is the central issue of following Jesus. If you had to boil down the invitation of life with God to one thing on our side, it's faith. It's faith. And yet it is often something we leave great room of not understanding, or we almost reject. And I know why this happens, because when you live in a culture of sincerity, you feel like something that got put in the hand of peddlers or manipulators, suddenly you want to run away as far as possible. When I talk about faith and reclaiming faith, what happens in so many people's minds is they instantly go to TBN or some prosperity gospel teacher or some person that they knew that used concepts like faith to manipulate or coerce to get their own agenda. And this reaction happens where we go, I don't want to be that, so we run into the opposite direction. But I say this often, let me just simply remind you, any theology you build out of reaction is a terrible theology. Just because someone misrepresents faith, the idea that you just run away from faith is not something you want to do. All of our theology responds to the person of Jesus. Nothing about what I believe takes shape in how other people treat it or how well they represent it. All of my faith is in response to the person of Jesus alone. And so many of us, even as people of faith, even as faith is the most central issue of life with God, run away from faith because we don't want to be that Christian. What? What? You don't have to be that Christian. How about you just walk with Jesus. And what matters to him needs to matter to us. And these complications, things like distorted faith, things like the reality that there are people who use faith as a proof of depth of belief. Things like, if you believed hard enough, if you believed fully enough, if you actually believed, this thing wouldn't have happened. So that's false, by the way. It's not true. It's nowhere in the scriptures. It's not actually what Jesus is saying around this. Faith matters. Don't hear me wrong. Faith matters way more than we think it matters. But that idea that, if you just would have believed a little bit more, that tragedy in your life wouldn't have happened. If you would have just prayed and fasted one more day, that breakthrough would have happened. See, we have these visions of distorted faith that if we could just somehow believe fully enough, we would receive the desires of our heart. And then we have this other thing I've already mentioned, that emotions are the truth tellers and our experiences are our authority. So in that idea, then what we do is we make faith an emotion, and we make our experiences with faith the ultimate truth teller of our lives. And then if we struggle with our emotions, we feel like a fraud. And in our desire, this is what happens. This is how the enemy twists us and manipulates us. We struggle with our emotions in a current moment, and because we want to be sincere in front of Jesus, and we feel like we're being a fraud by standing in a convictions our emotions aren't fully in alignment with, then in the name of sincere love for Jesus, we walk away from Jesus as if that is an accurate expression. And it's all a manipulative lie of the enemy. I'm not saying we don't have to contend to walk in our emotions in congruence, but when you and I experience emotions, they are not always telling the truth. In fact, they are rarely telling us the truth. Our emotions are often telling us about something that matters, that then needs to be honored and brought into alignment with the truth. And I can't tell you how many young believers I know have been manipulated in the name of sincerity because in the lack of a current emotional status, they feel like a fraud rather than recognizing sincerity is actually at the deepest moments when you're not feeling it. Not feeling it. Faith is when you're not feeling it, friends. Faith is easy when you're feeling it. The substance of faith is what you do when you go, I have no idea how this is going to happen. And I am struggling to get my emotions in alignment. And of course, the idea is that reason is the opposite of faith, that faith is like this thing that just take your brain out, throw it away, and jump into the abyss called faith. Actually, the scriptures are telling us that faith is built on the evidence of our reason. The faith is telling us that we actually build our faith on the evidence of tangible convictions. So faith is absolutely faith, but it's built on the midst of reason, not in the absence of it. And then the substance of, which is a whole sermon series in itself, the conflict of faith and suffering. The tension point of what you do when faith finds death and suffering in our lives moves us into storylines we never wanted. And what does it tell us about the character of God and the promises of God in the midst of suffering in our lives? But what I want us to see is what all of those things do is one small thing. They make faith about us. If I believe hard enough, if I feel sincere, if I can just take this jump into the unknown, if I am not going to find myself in suffering and pain, this is what happens. The substance of faith, which is about someone else, gets turned around and made to be all about us. And you and I have to recognize that in this journey of faith, we're gonna have to walk through all of the distortions to find the reality of what Jesus is inviting us into. And in that, we have to recognize the central place that faith holds. Hebrews 11 ends, let me read Hebrews 11, 1-6, just this invitation. Hebrews 11 is this invitation into life of the faith more than any other passage in the New Testament is trying to teach us about faith and uses person after person after person as an example of what faith is meant to look like. Listen to what this says. It says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, We understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. By faith, Abel brought God to a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke of those offerings. By faith, Abel still speaks. He keeps going on and on until this line in verse 6, and without faith, it is impossible to please God. Can I just stop for a moment here? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. So can I just maybe make the argument faith matters? It tells us something that's really important. Everything God will ever ask of you will require faith because faith pleases his heart. It is impossible to please God without faith. Maybe this is a foundational point. Faith is important. Whatever it is, it matters, right? But what is this thing we call faith? Well, certainly faith is a part of our salvation. Let me remind us of a few things about the nature of faith and a few things that Hebrews 11 teaches us about faith. Ephesians says this, and for by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one could boast. This is important. Now, let me be clear. We are saved by grace and by grace alone. Thank God. I need grace. You need grace. This is really good news. Nothing saves but grace. But Paul's telling us in Ephesians 2 that faith is a required element to encountering that grace. Well, how does that work? If grace alone saves, but you're telling me faith is a part, how do these things function? Let me give you a couple of silly analogies, but they're going to help you catch it. As often in my life in this season, I am nourished late by this thing called Taco Bell. I get hungry late at night, everyone's asleep, and I make bad decisions. But I get nourished by Taco Bell, through ordering it on Grubhub, right? So Taco Bell saves me, right? Or, condemns me, depends on if my wife was up here talking, right? But my food delivery service is what got it to me. There's a substance, and there's a way you find that substance. Let me give you another one. I are annoyed by Phil through his inability to give shorter sermons, right? There's a substance, and there's a delivery system. Part of what Paul's trying to tell you is that salvation is a substance we receive, and it is won for us by grace and by grace alone. You can't earn it. You can't work for it. You can't perform for it. There's no better, like God doesn't like you more or like you less. Like there's nothing you can do to somehow enter into the equation that grace alone creates as possibility. But do not misunderstand that doesn't mean there is a way we enter into that grace. And faith is the very vehicle that we now enter into that substance through. Faith is not what saves us, but faith is what leads us to what can. And what is centrally true about salvation is also the picture that we begin to see about the life in front of us. Listen to some of these things that Hebrews begins to tell us about the nature of faith. It begins again, now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and the assurance of what we do not see. You know what's interesting when I read that passage though? It feels like it leads me to conclusions that faith feels like a feeling. Faith sounds like a feeling. Look at those words. It's a confidence. I would describe confidence as a feeling. It's an assurance. An assurance sounds like a feeling. I would argue that this passage is not poorly interpreted. It's just that Bible translators are having a hard time keeping up with the way what words mean to us now rather than what they used to mean. I think the New King James Version translates this in a way that leads us to a better understanding. Listen to what it says in the different translations. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I would argue that both of those translations are accurate. One is just describing the more of the physical reality of them, and one would be interpreting the experience of receiving them. But this is important for us because what Hebrews teaches us about faith is not that it is a confident feeling, not that it is an assurant feeling, but that faith itself is a substance that can awaken a confidence. It is a evidence that can awaken an assurance. But when you understand that faith is not an emotion we have, it is actually a tangible reality we possess, it leads you into radically different understandings of what it means to live by faith and to walk by faith. Faith is not just a mindset. See, this is what we reduce faith down to an intellectual position. We reduce faith down to a dogma. We reduce faith down to a feeling, not understanding that faith is actually an experiential encounter that leads to a possession. And when you have it, it navigates your future and your life. And even these words, this word that we translate as this assurance, they're the substance. Hypostasis, it leads properly to possess, standing under a guaranteed agreement like a title deed. So if I own my home, and I have the title, is the title my house? No, of course not. But is the title an intellectual feeling? No, it's a real thing. Your faith is in something that isn't quite yet. But that doesn't mean it's nothing. Your faith is a possession like a title deed that is making promises about the future that is actually a guarantee. And when you understand the substance of faith is like that, then you can move past the realm of emotions and ideas into actually standing on the substance that you have. This other word, elenchus, it literally means certainty, a proof, a trial in order to prove, a proof of a certain persuasion. The way the context of this word works is what would be your final arguments in a defense case of a trial? And what Paul argues is that our evidence is the resurrection of Jesus. That you and I can stand on the confidence of the intellectual, historical, geographical, accurate, real resurrection of Jesus. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 6 that if we die with Jesus in our sin, that we die to our sin, then that gives us confidence that we will be raised like Jesus and experience his resurrection even in bodily form. Romans 6 tends to be a bit of a complicated passage, but what Paul's saying in essence is this. You want to know why a reason you can have hope in the resurrection? Because you've watched the transformation of your life. Do you know that, when did God save you? Are you a different person? I don't even have to ask you, you are. Are you a perfect person? No, you're not. But can I tell you, when I look back at the 24 years since I really gave my life to Jesus at 19, I understand something quite simple. I've experienced the resurrection of Jesus. I'm a different man, and I didn't do it. I didn't muster up the courage to finally figure out how to change my life. I just mustered up the courage to tell Jesus I believed him and didn't believe him and needed his help. And grace has done everything else. Every single aspect of my life is the resurrection work of Jesus. So I can actually look at my failings and tell you I have confidence about the resurrection of Jesus that I cannot see because I've seen the resurrection within me. And you can't take that away from me. It is not an idea or an emotion. It is a substance in my life of the Spirit of God. I have a title deed to my future because I can walk in the evidence not only of the literal resurrection of Jesus, but of the literal resurrection of me through him. Oh, guys, when we have to understand what's actually happening in our transformation, you want to know why you can have confidence for the future? Because you can look inside yourself and find Christ all over your life. Where in your failings, in your weaknesses, in your trials, in your hardships, in your circumstances, in every single storyline you never wanted to walk through, it's where God has put his life in the midst of yours. And you can hold on to that in what you don't understand and walk towards faith. Walk towards faith. Because faith is not a feeling. Faith is not an emotion. Faith is not an intellectual reasoning away. Faith is a tangible substance I possess and you possess that is the hope of a title deed speaking about a future reality. And it is the evidence of the resurrection work of Jesus, both in the literal nature that he woke up from the dead, which to me is an undeniable reality that you can place your hope in, and the reality of that resurrection work inside of me. Oh, guys, this is the picture. Faith is actually this glorious idea that transcends the circumstances of my life. That when I learn how to hold on to it, because I actually possess it. So do you. It's a real thing. It might be metaphysical in its nature, but it's a real thing. And when you learn how to hold on to true faith, it navigates your way forward. Let me just tell you a few more things and we'll move towards a close, which is a pastor's way of saying it. Almost there, not really, almost there. About 5 minutes, Sherry, and you can come on up. Think about so many things happen in Hebrews chapter 11. So many people get listed by the author of Hebrews, but he does focus in on the story of Abraham and Sarah. Let me just hit a couple of points really fast. Hebrews 11:11, this is what the author says. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Let me tell you something that the author of Hebrews is trying to tell you about faith. Faith is going to lead you to impossible things. So what happens when you are trying to navigate a life filled with impossible things? You learn from Sarah. What was her faith doing? Sarah held on to something that she had known and experienced in light of what seemed impossible in light of her circumstances. God's character. Think about what it says in Hebrews 11:17-19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was able to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring shall be reckoned. Abram reasoned with God that he could even raise from the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. This is literally what the author of Hebrews is saying. God looked at Abraham and said, hey, you're gonna have generations and families, literally through Isaac, and you need to kill him. And Abraham's like, oh, those two things don't work together, God. But then by faith, he said, but you keep your promises, so I guess you're just gonna resurrect Isaac. Okay. Abraham moved towards faith in something that was impossible because his trust in what? The character of God. Paul, the author of Hebrews, whoever it may be, tells us more and more examples. See, this is what we do. We make faith about us. Oh, but those who walked in faith made it nothing about themselves. And they said, God said I'm gonna have grandkids through Isaac. And he also saying I need to sacrifice him. He's a God who keeps his promises, so I guess he's gonna raise Isaac from the dead. Let's move forward. I'm not saying it was that easy. But by the way, Isaac, when he walked up the mountain with Abraham, was on board. We misread that whole passage. It's not time to teach you about the character of God of that passage in Abraham. It's not a statement about the evils of God. It is a statement about learning the character of God, who is showing us from the covenant of Abraham that there's only one who's gonna lay down his son for the reality of bringing union back to us with God, and it was God himself. And Abraham didn't manipulate Isaac to get up the mountain. Abraham and Isaac walked up the mountain together. Isaac was a grown man, and they together walked in faith. I don't have time to preach through all of that, but we have to begin to see this. Sherry, you can come up. Faith has this incredible place. It connects us to God. Christian faith is belief in the trustworthiness of Jesus and the gospel. Faith is a present possession of a future hope. Faith is a holistic embodiment of agreeing with God over our emotions and our circumstances. And we begin, as we learn more and more about this faith, this radical position of faith, we see that faith is always trying to point us somewhere. And it's always trying to point us towards these impossible places in our lives. Why? Look at a few more thoughts. Hebrews 11, it says, by faith, Abraham, when called to a place he would later receive his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. So there's a promise of a home, but there's an impossibility. This home belonged to somebody else. His faith was pointing him towards a promise filled with impossibilities. Story continues. Hebrews 11:11-12 says, and by faith, even Sarah, who was past her childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from one man, and he was as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Again, same pattern. What was the promise? A son, but it was filled with impossibilities. The author of Hebrews keeps telling us these stories. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered sacrifice. This is the one we already looked at. What was the promise? Descendants through Isaac. What was the impossibility? That Isaac had to be offered as a sacrifice. The author of Hebrews is showing us this pattern over and over again. This is simply it. Faith is inviting you into promises that are impossible. Impossible. And faith is navigating us to these fields of impossibility for a reason. You want to know why? Because the fields of impossibility in your life are the places of the giants that you fear. It's the places of your greatest concern and doubt and what keeps you up at night. The reason God's inviting you to the fields of impossibility, these places in your life that you can't do, is because those places that you can't do are actually the narratives that are controlling your future. God isn't playing some weird game with you called faith. He's walking with you to rescue you. Because in the places that are impossible are the giants in your Canaan that are controlling your destiny. Guys, this is the real substance of life. The things you fear, the things you say, if you will, God, where are you, God? Why didn't you, God? Why won't you, God? Will you ever show up, God? Those places, those questions, those realities in your life. You want to know why they have power in your life? Because they're controlled by the fears that are controlling you. And God is trying to teach us that in faith, I got to walk into the land that giants control in my heart. And when I walk into that land that giants control in my heart, I'm going to learn about what it means to trust Jesus, not the controlling mechanisms of my fear. And it is the place that all things are possible. That is not a statement that all things will happen. It is a statement that in that place, no matter what happens, Jesus is rescuing me. Oh, this is what we miss about faith. It's the salvation of Jesus continued between when he started it, at the moment we confessed faith to him, till the moment he returns and all the substance of faith is realized. Jesus is leading you to the places you fear the most. And the only way you'll get there is faith. So this is the one thing I'm trying to say. This is the one thing I want you to hear. Faith is leading you to what's impossible. And right now, what's controlling what's impossible is fear. And God wants to rescue you from what you fear. And the only way you can do that is faith. I know this story. Time and time again, God has invited my life and yours to fields of impossibility. And every time I move towards it, I find everything I'm afraid of. Where I'm inadequate, where I'm insufficient, where I'm insecure, where I want to control, where I don't trust the character of God, where I say I believe and I don't. It's all the places that I go, God, I believe you and I don't believe you. Oh, guys, it's a terrible thing to be a pastor and to believe him and not believe him sometimes. And to know that I have thousands of people that I actually have to care about in the middle of the fracturing of my own faith. I have no option. If I want to be a faithful man, I have no option but every single day to tell Jesus where I believe him and where I don't. Because I need his rescue in my life. I need his saving in my life. I need my life to not be controlled by the giants I'm afraid of, but I need to recognize that my God keeps his word into the promised lands he's calling into my future. And I have to walk first into this place called faith so that I can walk with my friends into that very same place. God wants to do that work in you. We've let fear navigate our future for so long. And Jesus wants to set us free. This is the invitation of faith. It's coming back to the beauty that my confidence is in the promise giver, not the promise. My confidence is in a God who keeps his word, not what he wants or allows or says might happen in the midst of it. That the anchor of my hope is his grace and his loving kindness, and that my future is navigated by his authority and not my own, and a God I've come to terms with that likes to walk with suffering with me and not lead me always out of it as I wish he would. But I've learned that it's even in the unimaginable things, in the things that will make no sense and I cannot make sense of until the life to come, that there is a faith. There's a faith. Why? Because I know God's character. I have no questions anymore. I have questions about the decisions God has made. I do not have questions about the character of who he is. Because God is doing a work of faith in me. It's the same work of faith that God wants to do in you. So I'm here to tell you, trust him. God wants to teach you some things about faith. Don't take faith and let it be filled with the caricatures of all these false ideas. Don't let faith be as cheap as your high highs. And don't let it be robbed by your low lows. Don't let faith be this idea of just this hopefulness, this wishfulness that just abandons reason. Don't let faith be controlled by all of the false straw man arguments that get peddled by our world. Don't let faith be robbed by prosperity gospel preachers that have hurt people. Don't build bad theology in response to bad theology. Come back to faith. Believe him. Because the word tells us Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he is telling you the truth. And when you learn how to anchor your life on God's character, when you learn how to stand on the substance of what has been done inside of your life, you'll realize that all of these places you fear, God's been leading you to them all along. Stop running away. Just get honest. Could the great first act of faith be telling God everywhere you don't have faith? And just say, Jesus, I'm afraid of this. And he'll say, I know. I know. That's why we're here. Why would God do faith? Just to manipulate you, trick you, just to prove to you that he's God and you're some little peon that he wants to control? No. Hand in hand through your greatest fears, because he loves you. That's faith. Faith is your rescue. It's the delivery system of salvation in every dimension of life. Come on, let me pray. So much more I need to say, wanted to say, but I've talked a little too long. That's the second service for you, isn't it? Jesus, I love you and I love this church, and I need your help. We need your help. I really do. You are inviting me into a school of faith, and I want it all. I'm so insufficient, but I trust your sufficiency. I'm so limited, but I trust your unlimited nature. I have such highs and lows. God, I'm fickle. Thank you that you never change. You do not change. Like the shifting of shadows, you remain the same. Oh God, do what only you can do. Save us, save us, save us. In Jesus' name, amen.